So here we have two controllers, the login controller, right? And we have the profile controller, right? That are both using this array of users, right? The login controller uses it when we click on the login function, and it wants to iterate over the list of users to try and find that user. Yes? Okay. And if it finds it, and then navigates to the profile, the appropriate profile. And same thing for with the profile. It uses it to map a user ID from the parameter, from the route parameters, and then to look up that user in the array. Yes? So they both need this array. But it's definitely not a good idea to have this array, just copied and pasted everywhere we need it, right? Certainly we're not going to have it when we get to the database, right? We don't want this. So instead, what we want to do is to centralize data access, right, or anything that has to do with manipulating the actual data. We want to centralize it in one single place, right? And then define operations that would allow us to read, write, update, remove, right, or change that data from within that within that module. Make sense? So let's do that next, right? So let's create here. We do that through the use of the creation of services, right? So let's create a service. We'll create the user service. So we'll create the user service, JavaScript. Call it user.service.client. Right? Notice the naming convention, right? It deals with data that has to do with user. Its role is that it's a service, meaning it's the one single place where I have to go to retrieve, update, delete, do anything that has to do with the data about users. Okay? It's going to be a singleton, right? Meaning one instance of this for the entire application. There's one place to go. Right, so to implement this, like any JavaScript file that we're going to ever write in this course, we're always going to put it inside of an ify statement, and I will repeat this over and over and over. Right, so don't forget, every file should be an ify statement. So in here, we're going to declare a service on the module. So first we're going to have to retrieve the module, right? So we're going to do it using the way we've been doing it so far. So dot module, and the module I believe is called WAMApp. Okay. Up to this point, we've been declaring controllers on the module. Two controllers and a config. Yes. Now we're going to declare a service. Now there's two ways of implementing services, right? I'm going to implement it one way here, and for the website, I'll implement it the other way. And then we can talk on why would you do one or the other. Okay? So let's create, one of the ways to implement it is using the dot factory function, right? You name the service. In this case would be the user service. Okay? And this registers the service all throughout the framework. I can refer to this service by name using that name, and it's known throughout the infrastructure, throughout that module, the WAMAP module. Okay, and I'm going to implement it in a function of the same name. Right? It doesn't have to have the same name, but I use the same names just to keep it straight in my head. Right? It's the naming convention that I follow. It's a very common one. So here's the function, the user service function. Okay, and here is where we want the data. The data is where it's going to live here. Well, really, the data is going to live on the server. Well, really, the data is going to live on the database. Okay, but we don't have that yet. Right? So instead, it's going to live right here. So this is as close as we are going to get to the data actually living where it belongs. Okay, so for now, we're going to be hosting it here. So I'm going to go back to the controller. I'm going to remove the users array, right? And I'm going to put it in the service right here. Everybody okay? Right. I'm also going to remove from the login. Right. We don't want the data in the controller. it should live in one single place in the service. Okay? Right. And this is a very common design pattern in general, right? But here's how you particularly implement it in Angular, right? But it's a very common design pattern in software engineering in general. Okay? So here's a service, and what the service is going to do is that it's going to provide an API that will allow us to manipulate this data. What are the types of manipulations that we need so far? Well, let's see. If we go back to the login, what are we doing here? Well, we are iterating over the array of users, looking for a user that matches the username and password. Basically, that's it, right? That's what we're doing. So we are finding users. Yeah, well, that's what we're doing, right? That's the action. And then there's a criteria by which we are finding users. We're finding them by username and password, right? So it'd be great if I could, grab this whole thing, right, and encapsulate it in a function, find user by username, right, and then I could call it, right? So let's do that. I'm going to grab this, remove it from here, and I'm going to move it over to the service. And I'm going to encapsulate it in a function called find user by username and password. Okay, so it would need to take in as arguments the username and the password. And there is our algorithm in there. Yes? Okay, it's going to iterate over the users directory array, which is right here. Is going to compare against the username that you pass as argument. Okay, so I'm going to remove this, no user object. We're just passing, wait a minute, like that, right? Yes. Username, password. We're going to match, oops, it's this one, right? This one. We're comparing the local user, right? The local user, we're comparing it. Now, if it finds it, if it finds a user, it should navigate. But this navigation, it should not be the responsibility of the service. The service should not care what you're going to do with the data. Its only responsibility is the data. Finding data, changing data, manipulating data, creating data, deleting data. It should not know what you're going to do. It shouldn't care what you do with this data, right? So this definitely does not live here, right? That still lives in the controller, right? And any error messages should also not live here. Right, the service's responsibility has nothing to do with the UI. It doesn't even know that there's a UI. It should not care about the UI. Its only responsibility is data. So I'm going to remove that. I'm going to put it back in the login. Okay. So if it finds it, it's going to maybe return _user, yes, or return null. So if it finds it, it returns the user instance. If it doesn't find it, it'll return null. Make sense? All right. Now, this function, notice that it's declared inside of this other function. So this function is inaccessible from outside here. Yes? The only way that it could be accessible is that if I create an object, that contains this, or somehow I return this object, this function. I could return this function. I could just say, return find user by password. So meaning this user service evaluates as a value, evaluates to find user by username and password. Okay, that's its value. It's a function. So this function returns a function, right? And this would be okay if this were the only function in here. Yes. Right, but it's not going to be the only function, right? We want to find users by username and password. We also want to be able to create new users. We want to be able to update users. We want to delete a user. We want to find it by a user ID, right? So we're going to have lots of functions in here that we want to host, right? So instead, what we're going to do is that we're going to return an object. Here's the object. There's my object. Okay, well, maybe you don't like that syntax. Maybe a better syntax might be that I create an object. There it is. In JavaScript, creating an object is as trivial as putting it in a curly brackets. Okay, and then inside, you can put the names of the attributes of that object. As the name of the attributes, I'm going to use the name of the functions. And the value of those attributes is going to be the actual instance of the function. So a reference to the function. Once I have that object, I can return the API. I can return the object. What this means is that this instance, the user service, if anybody references it, if anybody refers to it, its value, it's going to be this object. Right? The value is going to be that object. Meaning that anybody who references it, for instance, here's the login controller. The login controller can reference it and say, I want that service. Pass me an instance of that service. Right? Now that I have, sorry, that's not the service. User service. Give me an instance of that user service. Now that I have the user service, what is it? What object is it? It's this object. Yes? The value of this is whatever I am returning. I'm returning this object. Yes? So this is this object. Yes? Because it's that object, I can say dot the attribute. Dot the attribute. Yes? What does this evaluate as? What's the value of that? The value of that, it's this function. Because it's that function, I should just be able to pass it those attributes, those username and password. I should be able to pass it user.username and user.password. And this returns either a user instance or null. Right? So var user. Right? Now that I have the user, I can ask if user is null, then I can do an error message. Else I navigate to the profile. Yes? Okay? All right? And so once we've created this user service, we need to make sure that we declare it, we load it in our index page. We need that service. That service is called script src service. There it is, user service. Okay, and we're using it only in the login controller just now. We're only using it in the login controller. Let's see if we broke something. Let's go back to the login. Refresh. Let's see if we have any error messages. Okay, we didn't have any error messages. That's promising. Let's do Alice. And Alice, login. Oh, we have an error message. Underscore is not defined in login controller. Oh, yeah, forgot to remove that underscore. Let's move that underscore. It's just user, right? It's this user right here. So let's refresh. So there's Alice and Alice. It navigates to the profile just like before. Yes? That makes sense? Right? Notice that the profile is complaining. The profile is complaining, saying that it is that there is no users array anymore in the profile controller. That's okay, right? We removed it from there, right? We removed it, but it looks like it worked on the login, right? Just to check real quick, we could just put the users array back into the profile controller just to verify that the ID is being passed and whatnot, right? So let's see. If we refresh, there it is, Alice in Wonderland. And if we had logged in as Bob, we have Bob and Marley. See that? So there it is. We created our very first service to implement for the user lookup by username and password. Okay. Right. Any questions? That makes sense. Right. We'll do tons of these, so we'll practice it several times. Right? We'll practice it many times until it'll start becoming secondhand. Right. Let's do one more function before we go to the break.